So, in a couple of weeks, I'll be heading back to Europe and I'll be doing an event in Galway, Ireland, which is on the west coast of Ireland. I'll be doing an event with a couple of, we'll talk about Paul a little bit more. Martin Shaw, he's a storyteller, has taught storytelling at Stanford, currently lives in the UK. A couple of Dominican friars, and Paul Kingsnorth, who converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. I'd done an event a couple of years ago with Paul in Ireland, and Marcus, another friend. Marcus lives in Ireland, and he tends to work in some of these Roman Catholic retreat centers, and he's participates online with a lot of the same community that I do. So this will be my second conversation with Paul Kingsnorth. Paul recently gave a talk at First Things, which is was a magazine and now it's a website, that also Roman Catholic in origin. And the title of his talk was Against Christian Civilization. And it kind of sent a lot of waves through the internet. Right now, there's sort of a revival of Christianity in some circles. A number of people saying, well, I don't know if Christianity is true, but as our society gets increasingly post-Christian, even people who don't believe in God are starting to miss Christian influence in society. And one person called them utilitrads. They are traditionalists because traditionalism seems to have a lot of utility. They like people to get married and stay married and pay their taxes and be good citizens. And they've noticed that religious people tend to behave in that way. And what's been interesting is that a lot of this has happened sort of in the wake of new atheism that passed in the early 2000s and the great dechurching, with church attendance overall in the United States continuing to decline, and more people no longer affiliating with Christianity or one of the Christian traditions, but calling themselves none of the above. Aaron Renn, another guy that I've done events with, he recently wrote a piece and said Donald Trump is the president for the post-Christian America. He recently released a book called Life in the Negative World and talked about how people have sensed that, let's say if you remember the 50s and 60s, being a Christian was something that everyone sort of expected everyone to be. And there was a certain degree of public behavior that people expected in those years. A good example of that is the presidential candidacy of Gary Hart. In 1988, Gary Hart was very much the front runner to be the Democratic nominee for president of the United States, until pictures emerged of him with a cute young woman sitting on his lap who was not his wife. The woman in the picture next, with a much older Gary Hart, that is his wife, who just passed away about a year or two ago, and people sort of marked that. But what they noticed was that in 1988, if you were going to be a presidential candidate, even though presidents long have had extramarital affairs, John F. Kennedy to say the least, but if it was publicly known that you were unfaithful to your wife, a majority of Americans and both political parties deemed a candidate ill-suited for the presidency. And when Ronald Reagan was first elected, of course, he had been governor of the state of California, but when he was first elected, there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not America would elect a president who had been divorced. And, we currently have a president who was divorced 3 times and quite famously likely not faithful to any of his 3 wives. In fact, a recent court case with a porn star who he had an affair with while his wife was pregnant with his youngest child. And he sort of denied it, but yet in another way, for some people, the fact that he did such a thing is a bonus for many people. And so this sort of shows the way that kind of the assumptions of the nation have changed over the last recent decades. In fact, some people that 20 years ago were out there saying Christianity is a mind virus. Christianity is a mental illness. Anybody who says they believe in a God up in the sky should have their head examined. Many of these people now are seriously saying things like, well, you know what? I wish there were more Christians. And whether or not people believe it, maybe they should be civilizational Christians. Maybe they should follow Christianity even if they don't believe it, or at least behave that way. And it's quite a change in the conversations. Old new atheists are questioning their old assumptions. Now, Paul Kingsnorth himself became a Christian a few years ago. He was raised in England, basically a secularist, had a career as a writer around environmental issues, had tried Wicca, had looked into Buddhism, and about 5 or 6 years ago became a Christian at a Romanian Orthodox monastery near his farm in Ireland. And when, in fact, I'm in Ireland that Sunday, I will be joining him. I've never been to an Orthodox service, so I'll be joining him. He's invited me to go to his church with him, and I will see what the Orthodox liturgy is all about. But his conversion caused quite a stir, because people didn't expect someone who was so outspoken on environmental issues and so radical in terms of his post-Christian beliefs to come around and become a Christian again. And so there's been a lot of chatter about this, and we've been emailing the group that's going to speak back and forth, discussing what we're going to talk about. And one of the things that he said to me, he says, you know, I'm really trying to figure out how I should live my life as a Christian. That's a pretty common question. And in fact, the way he phrased it was exactly like the title of a Francis Schaeffer book from the 1970s and 80s, How Then Should We Live? And in fact, I'm now old enough to remember many of these questions and many of these issues going through the church in the 70s and 80s. I remember when I was first here, I was talking to Earl Marlink about something, and he said, so many of these things just come through again and again, and you live long enough, and you notice it's not repetition, but they sort of rhyme what's going on through the church. Jesus deeply impacted how our culture is. He smuggled in a moral imaginary into the Western world. And so generations after have sort of had the Sermon on the Mount ringing in their heads. It's so interesting seeing a lot of people interested in sacraments and ancient Christianity and all of the rites and rituals that go in them. I remember reading Dallas Willard in seminary, who raised many of the same things as an evangelical Christian who taught in the University of Southern California in their philosophy department, passed away a few years ago. The excellent book, which is in our library, The Divine Conspiracy, where he goes through the Sermon on the Mount, very much with the question, what does this mean for how we live? Now, we're in Luke, and the Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew, but all of the gospel writers take the teachings of Jesus and present them in a context. Most famously in the Gospel of Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is up on a mountain. The setting is a little bit different in the Gospel of Luke, but a lot of this symbolism is similar. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. And we've already seen this a number of times in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus gets away, spends time in prayer with the Lord. And the fact that he goes up into a mountain reminds us of a number of things. Moses, of course, went up on the mountain when God descended on Sinai to meet with God. And the elders of Israel went up to meet God on the mountain as well. And so this is sort of a recollection, a recapitulation of that meeting. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them. The number of 12 isn't arbitrary. It's the same number of tribes that Israel had. And he designated them apostles. Simon, we met him last week, who he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, we met all of them last week, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon who was called the Zealot, Judas son of James, Judas Iscariot who became a traitor. So while he had a good number of disciples, he chose 12 to be designated representatives, official representatives who would validate the stories of Jesus and be able to teach them to others. He comes down from the mountain, sort of like Moses, bringing the law, and he commissions these disciples. He went down with them and stood on a level place. And this is why in Matthew he's up on a mountain seated, so it's a Sermon on the Mount. In Luke he goes down to a level place, which is usually why in Luke it's called the Sermon on the Plain. You have the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain. But as you'll see, they're quite similar. A large crowd of his disciples, see, the 12 weren't his only disciples. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem, from the coastal region around Tyre and Sidon. So Tyre and Sidon was a Gentile region. So you have this sense of Jesus before a mixed multitude. Again, this is similar to Moses and the mixed multitude that comes out of Egypt with Moses, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And we talked about the healing miracles last week. Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and we talked about those kinds of miracles last week. And the people all tried to touch him. We talked about Jesus touching for miracles last week, because power was coming out from him and healing them all. Jesus is delivering people from demonic oppression, possession, illness, continuing his war with the devil to free God's people. But it's sort of a chaotic scene, and we saw that with Jesus in the boat before. So all of these stories are coming together. Looking at his disciples, he said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." Now suddenly, the most famous part of the sermon, or one of the most famous parts of the Sermon on the Mount, which are the Beatitudes, well, they seem to be here too, but they're slightly different. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and weep for joy, because great is your reward in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. Now, part of the difficulty of being a preacher is that many of you here in church have been reading these stories for years. And when I start reading, "Blessed are you who are poor," some of you mentally were thinking, "Blessed are you who are poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." It's already written in. They're not shocking anymore. And so part of the challenge for these Beatitudes is you're not as familiar with the format. So we're in February, we're singing African American songs. There's a style, there's a pattern, there's a repetition. Some of you grew up with this music, and so this music just sort of flows right out. The difficulty comes when someone changes the rhythm. When they change, Chemo, we were just singing that song, and Chemo just kept playing because we used to just keep singing. And it's like, well, we're not singing that verse. It's jarring. And because Christians are so familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, what they don't understand is how shocking what Jesus said was to the people who were listening. And the reason is this. If you go to the Old Testament, especially in the book of Psalms and Proverbs, are full of Beatitudes. They're all over the place, but they're all of a certain kind. The book of Psalms begins with one. "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his inheritance. Blessed is the man whom thou dost chasten, O Lord, and whom thou dost teach out of my law. Beatitudes are very religious things, and they sort of work like this. If I were to create my secular Beatitudes from your doctor, let's say, your doctor might say, blessed are you who exercise, eat well, and go to the doctor regularly, so you will live a long and healthy life. If you were to go to your financial manager, he would say, blessed are you who save your money and don't spend frivolously, for you will have money later into retirement. If you're a parent, they might say, blessed are you who correct your children and love them well, for they will grow up and bless you in your old age. Beatitudes are sayings of wisdom where the outcome follows the introduction. Blessed are you who save your money, for you will have money in the bank. Blessed are you who eat right, for you will have good health. Blessed are you who drive carefully, for your car will be intact and you'll be saved from accidents. Blessed are you who have insurance, so in the day of difficulty, you'll have the money you need. On and on and on and on. Those are what Beatitudes are. Now look at Jesus' Beatitudes. Blessed are you who are poor. Now, I've never heard a parent say, I want my child to grow up and be poor. No, I want my child to grow up at least have enough to eat and put a roof over their head. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you who are hungry now. And again, every parent is like, I want to make sure my child has food in their stomach. There's nothing blessed about being poor. There's nothing blessed about being hungry. Blessed are you who weep now. When we see people weeping, we console them. Plus, well, this has a sense of place and time as well. Now, in common religion, Beatitudes are very normal. What is common religion? Common religion says this, and this has everything to do with the American context. People look around and they say, Americans don't save enough. Americans don't stay married long enough. Too many children are born out of wedlock. Too many Americans have no savings. Too many Americans eat the wrong food. Too many Americans have diabetes. Too many Americans boom, 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 boom. Well, common religion is about making society better. Common religion expects the payoff in this life. Live a pious life. Your children will be blessed by your sobriety, your thrift, your frugality, and you will live secure in old age, blessed with wealth, savings, fruitfulness, etc. These Beatitudes are not like that. And there's always a sense of, are these commands? Or are these about people sort of who find themselves in a situation? And Jesus very much locates rewards in these Beatitudes for current hardships into a future time and into a heavenly realm. And this really disturbs people. Now, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you don't have these. These are woes. And just like I can create a list of blessed are in the Old Testament, I can create a list of woe is. Woe is you who shoots up drugs all the time. Woe is you who can't get to work on time. Woe is you who won't take care of your health because your health will abandon you. Woe is you who drinks away all your income. It's just obvious outcomes. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. Now, this has caused a lot of problems for Christians over the years, and mostly Christians just sort of ignore it. And actually, Christians have a point, because in the Old Testament,
God's favor on Abraham was seen because Abraham was wealthy. God's favor on Job was seen because Job was wealthy and his children were well. And so when it all came crashing down, Job's three friends in common religion said, see, God isn't happy with you. Look at the circumstances of your life. Jesus has taken what everyone assumed and inverted it. And this is even quite unusual because let's look at the kinds of things Jesus did. Can you imagine the feeding of the 5,000? They get out there and Jesus is preaching long and everybody's getting tired and it's getting late. And the disciples say, hey, we got about 15,000 people here and it's getting late and people got to get home and there's no McDonald's that they can stop at. And Jesus says, no, blessed are the hungry. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus tells his disciples, you feed them. And the disciples are like, we don't have any food. And what does Jesus do? He feeds them. So there's tension here. Because on one hand, someone in the crowd might have said, Jesus, you said blessed are the hungry, but you fed those 5,000 until they were satisfied. So how are we supposed to understand both of these things? Are these commands? Are we to actively seek out being poor, hungry, unhappy, and persecuted? That's actually fairly easy to do. It's easier to seek out being poor, hungry, unhappy, and persecuted. You won't like being it, but it's super simple. Fools all over the world manage this. Are these consolations for involuntary conditions caused by faithfulness to Jesus, or just caused by a fallen world? Is this the life of discipleship? Jesus was pointing to his disciples, teaching them this. Is there a hierarchy of disciples? Are disciples with less money better than disciples with more money? Are disciples that are unhappy better than disciples that are happy? Are disciples who suffer better than disciples who are comfortable? This is really a hard problem. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Paul Kingsnorth was talking about, which triggered everyone. And everybody was like falling all over themselves, having fighting about what I didn't like what Paul Kingsnorth said. I like what he said. What was interesting is that Paul Kingsnorth basically got the script from Jesus. Now, when I go to Ireland, I'm going to be staying in a monastery. And you know what? They're going to feed me. And they're going to put a roof over my head. And they all live there. Goods collected. Medical paid for. Some of us look at that and say, that doesn't sound too bad. See, the words of Christ triggered what happened in church history was that by the 3rd century, people listened to this and they said, I'm going to do exactly what Jesus said. One of the first monks to ever do this was a guy named St. Anthony, and he's written by, his life story is written by Athanasius. And so he decided to leave it all behind, and he went and he lived in a cave, and he lived off the food that people would bring to him, and he wore rags, and he was poor, and everyone around said, wow, that's a super Christian. He's really committed. So then someone else moved into the cave next door. And someone else lived in the other cave. And everyone was like, wow, these are super Christians. I've lived my life in comfort and happiness and wealth. You know what I'm going to do before I die? I'm going to give all my money to those guys living in the caves. And they did. And you know what happened? They built a big, beautiful church around those caves. And it's kind of a funny thing, because the truth is, if you want to try this, what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, which is when you fast, don't tell anybody. When you do these things, don't tell anybody, because the thing is, when people find out that you're really consecrated and serious, they get inspired. And then they're curious. There's a great scene of this dynamic in the movie Forrest Gump, and I don't know if you remember that sort of Jenny went away and Forrest, after the Vietnam War, didn't know what to do, and Forrest loved to run, so he started running. So he ran all the way to one coast, then he ran all the way to the other coast, and it got on the news that this guy is running, and people are like, and so, of course, in sort of the Forrest Gump movie way, Forrest Gump invented the jogging fad in the 1970s, and he wore Nike sneakers, and all these people followed him, and everybody, why are you running? And of course, it's Forrest Gump. I like to run. And he inspired a nation. But it was just jogging. So the irony of what happened when people left it all behind was that civilization actually followed them. Now, by the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern period, this actually became a huge problem. And Christian monks were not seen as ascetics, they were seen as corrupt. And generation after generation, people leaving their gold and their lands and all of their riches to monasteries meant that in Northern Europe, monasteries controlled about a third of the land. And they had a good deal of the gold. And while individual monks had vows of poverty, the monasteries themselves were enormously wealthy. And what this did was, with each new monastic movement, like St. Francis, they sort of shook the dust off their feet from the last monastic movement and said, we're really going to be poor. And everybody was like, wow, they're really poor. I'll give them my money. And they became rich too. And this cycle went over and over and over again until, of course, one young monk named Martin Luther looked at this and said, I don't think this is the right way. No more monasteries. And so in Protestant lands, the monasteries were closed. And some of the kings, like Henry VIII, actually, even before the Protestant Reformation, saw all the money that was held up in monasteries and all the land. Henry VIII just abolished monasteries so he could take all the land and the gold. Governments like to do that. So, many felt at the time of Luther that monasteries had become corrupt and a sham. So Luther closes the monasteries, and the monks and nuns married each other and started having families. And right then, people began to notice something. Is it easier to be a holy man in the midst of a holy community that has everything paid for you? Or is it harder to be married and have children and have all of the cares of the world? And so Protestants tended to push away from monasteries, but one of the interesting things that happened with Protestants was the same dynamic happened, and foreign missionaries then sort of became the monastics of Protestantism, because foreign missionaries would suffer for the Lord, and then people would give to foreign missionaries. And what's interesting about now, for a while in the 70s and 80s, people would look at basically the number of people volunteering to be nuns just sort of went through the floor. But then we had all these people walking around in saffron robes. Post-Christian spiritual Americans would look at them and say, ooh, look, they're serious about their spirituality. And the whole thing starts all over again. Now, the question that Paul Kingsnorth asked, the question that Francis Schaeffer asked, it's the same question we all have to ask. Whether you're living in a monastery, or you're living alone, or you're living with your family, what is the call of Christ on my life? And there's an ironic condition of affluence, is that people who so inspirationally give it all away had something to give away. And people who never had anything, well, how does that work? Recently, the new vice president on Fox News talked about America first and talked about, prioritizing our family and our country, et cetera, and people sort of criticized him for it. But the irony is that if you read his autobiography, Hillbilly Elegy, he was a poor kid who worked his way up. And so it's always hard to figure out, how does this work? In fact, many in the Middle Ages who were born into poverty went into the monastery. Why? Because at least in the monastery, you know what? They feed you every day. When you get sick, they take care of you. You have a place to lay your head. And so there we're stuck wondering what to do with Jesus' blessings and woes. Now, we're also sort of stuck between the command or invitation or involuntary situation of the negatives that Jesus called blessed. Jesus himself delivered many who were blessed by poverty and malady into health and wellness. So, what on earth do these things mean? What's interesting, in fact, what these teachings have done is exactly what people have tensions about. Because until Jesus taught this, nobody in their right mind would have thought about morality or consecration in the same way. Jesus establishes a conflicted, unattainable ideal. Recently, I was just reading a book about a group of, I might have mentioned it in a sermon. The title of the book was They Flew. And it was about late medieval, early modern monks who levitated. And a bunch of interesting things. But part of what was happening is that people were having competition to eat less and starve themselves more and do all of these things. And it just got very strange. But what you feel is that there's this conflicted, unattainable ideal that has continued to exert a strong gravitational pull on us as individuals and on us together as a civilization. In the ancient world, if your king was enormously wealthy, you would say God has blessed him. Here in the United States, the president should be the servant of the people, shouldn't enrich himself in office. There's all these assumptions that we possess that directly come from the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain that basically drive us into this way to watch people who are consecrated and say they really love the Lord, even though there are interesting ironies that pop up along the way. Luther felt this pull. Paul Kingsnorth feels this pull. Anyone who is captured by the vision of the crucified Christ feels that pull, and it won't let us go. It doesn't answer the question, what should you do? Now, I could tell all of you to sell all you have and live here on the, I'll open the gate for you, and because we don't have that long line of homeless people right against the, so we can have some of you sell all your houses and you live here along the foundation of the Lord, as one person called it. But then, of course, you would be under the overhang of the church. And then someone who slept out in the rain would be more holy than the ones who slept under the eaves. I mean, this is the way that this thing goes. But at the same time, we recognize there's something extremely valuable here happening. And in fact, if we read the gospel, we discover that Jesus treats people on a case-by-case basis. As I noted before, he didn't declare to the 5,000 hungry people, "Blessed are you who are hungry." He might have in fact said that in that sermon, but then he went to feed them all. There is a demoniac on the Gentile side of the lake, and Jesus goes there, and he's full of 1,000 demons. And Jesus delivers him, and he's so grateful. He says, "Jesus, I want to follow you. I'll leave my people, I'll leave my home, I'll leave everything. I want to follow you and be with you." And what does Jesus say to him? Go back to your family and tell them what God has done for you. What does that mean? It means that Christ has a call on each of us. And we have to figure out what his calling for us is. Peter leaves all, but takes his wife. Paul says, you know what? Being a disciple, being an apostle, it's a little bit easier if I don't have family obligations behind me. But each person has to figure out, what is your calling? How will you live? Are you poor? Blessed are you. Are you wealthy? Well, you're going to have the trials of wealth to deal with. These are what we need to figure out. Jesus' sermons don't go away, but they pull on us, and they stretch us, and they stress us to ask exactly the right questions, the questions that Paul Kingsnorth is asking. But I'd say misery, deliverance, gratitude, misery, deliverance, gratitude. The point here is not, and I think Luther saw this clearly, how can I earn God's attention? How can I earn God's favor? No. You've received God's grace. The point is, how do you express your gratitude to God for what he's done for you? Like that demoniac. How exactly? The details? Well, you're going to have to work that out with your calling to God. You're going to feel that pressure. Do I express gratitude well enough? Is my giving sacrificial enough? How, in fact, do I live my life? Do I live a life of indulgence? Or do I live a life for Christ? We all have to wrestle with that in our own hearts. But what Jesus does is, in fact, set the standard before us. Because on the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body given for you." And when he says, "Do this in remembrance of me," it doesn't just mean participate in the sacrament. It means you saw how I live like I live. Say, "But I'm married." Okay. You're going to have to figure out what it means to be a Christian married person. Well, I have children. Figure out what those responsibilities mean. We all have to figure out what those responsibilities mean, but we do so in Christ.